Hi, I'm Blaine Grimes, and I am the Chief Development Officer here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I have a bit of laryngitis, so I hope that that doesn't throw you off a bit. Can everyone in the back hear me? Oh yeah, I can also mic myself. One moment, that'll be, you'll really hear my scratchy voice. 1 second.
Put that here. Doesn't want to grab onto my sweater. There we go. Okay, now you can hear me better, right? Okay, good. So I'll say again, my name is Blaine, and I'm the Chief Development Officer here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here. I was looking at the list for tonight, and it looks like there are a lot of folks here who are fairly new to us. Can I quickly see folks who've never been to GMRI before to a lecture? Yeah, there's a fair number of you guys that are new, so welcome. My job is to make sure that you all are oriented briefly to what it is we do here, and then I'm going to introduce Jen and we'll get on with the lecture. First, a bit of logistics. I presume when you came in that you understood that you can also, anytime you need, you can get out, and you can go out the side doors either, preferably this back door here, and if you need the restroom, please feel free to walk yourself out, and it's down the hallway on your left-hand side. Is there anyone that needs anything in terms of hearing? Because sometimes we have the ability to help everybody with additional hearing aids if anyone needs anything. Okay, good. So you guys are good on this. Jen will be mic'd as well, so you should be able to hear her, and she won't have the same laryngitis issue that I have. So GMRI is a really exciting organization. We've been here for about 12 years now on this site, and we're an independent, nonprofit science research education institution, and our mission is to pioneer collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. We recently rewritten our mission statement as a part of a new strategic plan, which we'll be publishing on our website shortly. And we're very excited about it because it begins to pull together in a very cohesive way the science research, the community work we do, particularly with the communities along the waterfronts and our fishing industry, and our education program, which is a statewide education program focused primarily on middle school students. So we're seeing something in this room. We see about 10,000 students a year from Maine's 5th and 6th grades. About 70% of the students across the state of Maine every year come here free of charge for a science, immersive science experience. Another exciting thing just to let you all know about is this whole space is going to be transformed in the next year because we've been doing this program for now, the education program, for 10 years. We've gotten some wonderful funding from NASA to reimagine and reinvent the education that we do here in this space, and our entire room will be transformed and we'll have a different set of stations and more contemporary, really exciting technology coming in that I think will, again, wow students. Can you imagine that this is not wow enough anymore? I still think it's like amazing. When we first came in, the kids would like go, take a big deep breath, and now when they come in, they try to manipulate the touch screens because of iPods, right? So it's just fascinating how iPads and iPhone technology has changed so rapidly in the 10 years we've been here. So with that, let me tell you that we also, obviously, we have this lecture series. This is part of a really interesting one, Debunking Myths, and I hope many of you come to other of our lectures and really enjoy the series as we put it together. And we're beginning to think about what our lecture series will be for this next winter series. So we haven't finished that up, but it's the next one in motion. I'm going to introduce my very good friend, Jen Levin. Jen is here tonight to talk about debunking myths about seafood and seafood consumption. Jen's been with GMRI for about 8.5 years now, which I was just shocked. She and I were talking about that. I've been here 12, but it feels like just a day or two, practically, in terms of the pace that we keep here. Jen started our seafood program, so she not only runs the seafood sustainability program, but she was our first hire, and she has actually built this program from scratch. She's incredibly accomplished, nationally recognized in the work that she does, and has brought GMRI really to the national forefront in the work we do in this region. We work across the supply chain, and I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit more, but we have relationships all around the globe, and we have really interesting relationships throughout the supply chain, from literally boat to plate. So not only are we working with seafood processors and distributors and retailers, big consumers, but we're also dealing with the fishermen every day on the boats. So with that, I want to introduce Jen, whose passion is sustainability and renewable resource management, and we'll get started. Thanks, Jen.
Great, thanks so much, Blaine. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for curiosity about aquaculture. Tonight's talk is about the facts on fish farming, the end of an environmental disaster. Or is it? My hope tonight is to present some information about aquaculture globally and perhaps debunk some of the myths or generalizations that people tend to make about fish farming, and then open up a conversation about aquaculture's role in feeding a growing planet. But before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I am Jen Levin. I manage the Sustainable Seafood Program here at GMRI. But I'm also from Wisconsin. I'm a Badger. I went to school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, got an undergraduate degree in wildlife ecology. Meanwhile, spent some time working out in Yellowstone and Badlands National Parks, and a few years at the Department of Natural Resources in the Bureau of Wildlife Ecology, promoting hunting and trapping, before moving on to Washington, D.C., where I worked for the National Association of State Foresters, communicating about sustainable forestry practices, and then on to the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, where we worked really hard to get more people out recreating on the water. And there I managed the sustainability, education, and market research programs. At that point, I was lucky enough to move up to the state of Maine and work for the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance. I got to know a lot of fishermen throughout the region and became very familiar with the region's wild fisheries management and some of the issues facing our fishermen in this region. I went on to work at the Gulf of Maine Ocean Observing System and helped facilitate the development of the Northeastern Regional Association of Coastal Ocean Observing Systems. And I'm probably the only person who can say that without stuttering after spending a couple of years on that project, NIRACUS for short. Meanwhile, got my master's in business administration from the University of Southern Maine. So, then came here to GMRI, where I managed the Sustainable Seafood Program. Why am I giving a talk about fish farming? Well, as Blaine alluded to, I have a career focus on sustainable use of renewable resources. And over the past 8.5 years, I've been working with the seafood industry in understanding where our seafood comes from, what its environmental impact is, and what we can do as a community to mitigate those environmental impacts and improve the sustainability of seafood production. Work with conservation organizations throughout North America. I consult with industry partners and industry associations, research scientists here at GMRI and elsewhere to understand what is happening today and what the future looks like. So, about this talk. It does include a lot of information from those conservation organizations and industry members and industry organizations. I worked really hard to avoid biased sources of information. And if anybody has ever tried to Google information about fish farming, it's difficult because you might find data that supports one side of a story and then data that supports a totally different picture. Sometimes I would find a research paper about a farm in Norway and then another research paper about a different farm in Norway that told a very different story. So you'll notice that a lot of the sources that I reference in my presentation tonight are government sources, like the U.S. Department of Ag, the United Nations Food and Ag Organization, and others, in an attempt to make sure that I'm citing unbiased sources of information. This presentation is not comprehensive. There's no way that we could touch on all of the nuances and all of the complexity around fish farming globally. My goal tonight is to touch on some of the information that's out there, maybe provide a new and different perspective on aquaculture and its environmental impact, but it is by no means comprehensive. In fact, there was a lot of information I wanted to include that I had to edit out, but so people spend their whole careers studying this stuff and they're still learning new things every day. And finally, I know that this talk reflects a fundamental bias towards aquaculture. And I want to acknowledge that right up front. So tonight's talk First, we're going to talk about why aquaculture is important, and basically why GMRI was motivated to do this lecture, to basically try to debunk some of the most common myths out there about aquaculture, because it is important. And then we'll have some fun doing a little fact or fishy exercise and addressing some of aquaculture's baddest rumors, some of the most common generalizations that are made about fish farming and farmed fish. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the innovations that are going on in aquaculture to address sustainability concerns. This is a Debunking Ocean Myths lecture series. I have 2 myths that I can debunk. And the first one is that aquaculture is good, and the second one is that aquaculture is bad. I think we're done here. There are no generalizations that can be made about any kind of aquaculture, about any kind of fish farming. Aquaculture can be one of the most sustainable, earth-friendly food production systems on the planet. It also can be, and has been in the past, very destructive and cause for concern. But these are the 2 myths that we can absolutely right away debunk. But the fact is that aquaculture is real, and aquaculture is a big part of our food production system. And just to say, let's say this is about now. So this is wild capture fisheries over time, production of wild capture fisheries versus aquaculture. And you can see that while aquaculture has been growing and will continue to grow into the future, wild capture fisheries is likely to level out and possibly even decrease in production over time. So aquaculture is and will continue to be a big part of our seafood production. And we need to feed the world. Our population is growing globally. This is a really great depiction of the Earth as far as hectares per person on the planet over time. And by 2050, our ability to have enough land to produce food for a growing population will be seriously compromised. But we're an ocean planet, right? 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. It's home to 80% of all life. 40% of all people live within 60 miles of the coast globally. I thought it was a pretty fascinating stat. And food production from the sea is also the only production system over the last 30 years that has outpaced the rate of population growth. So we've managed to continue to grow our food production at a faster pace than our population has grown. So the ocean as a food production place is important, but this is not new news. This is something we've known for a long time. In fact, the National Aquaculture Act of 1980, how many people knew that there was a National Aquaculture Act of 1980? Honestly, I didn't know that until I started researching for this talk. So I'm going to quote a few things from the National Aquaculture Act of 1980. To satisfy the domestic market for aquatic food, the United States imports more than 50% of its fish and shellfish. That's 1980, right? Today, we import more than 90% of the seafood we consume in the United States. It's gotten worse. Another thing from the Act of 1980. Aquaculture currently contributes approximately 13% of world seafood production. Well, we just saw the graph, so this is no surprise. Today, it's actually over 50% of the world's seafood production comes from aquaculture. And finally, this one's a little bit longer. Congress declares that aquaculture has the potential for reducing the United States trade deficit in fisheries products, for augmenting existing resources, thereby assisting the United States in meeting its future food needs and contributing to the solution of world resource problems. It is therefore in the national interest, and it is the national policy, to encourage the development in aquaculture in the United States. Well, today's seafood, not just aquaculture is half of seafood, but today's seafood contributes $11.2 billion to our national trade deficit, and it's second only to oil in the natural resources category. So in spite of our understanding that this is important, we have not gotten very far on these goals. Here's a depiction of aquaculture production. The United States is represented there, although you can barely see it. Asia is the big blue section. So 2011, the United States produced about 0.8% of all aquaculture, while Asia produced 88%. But there's a lot of potential. This is a really great report that just came out last month. Lucky for me, just in time for this talk. The report is Mapping the Global Potential for Marine Aquaculture. The map on top is today's production, shown in colors. The darker colors are more production, lighter colors less. You can see China is a really big aquaculture producing country. Looks like Chile is too. You see Norway up there. They're big aquaculture producers. Down here in the lower right, this map depicts the potential for aquaculture, and it's a great study. I've got a link if anybody's interested in seeing the whole thing. It basically takes out any places that are marine protected areas or not nutrient rich, maybe places that are too deep for aquaculture. So this is really basically taking into account viable waters for aquaculture. And you can see at the bottom, the potential production represented in that lower map is 100 times the current global seafood consumption. It's amazing potential. Another really fun fact, the aquaculture production capacity of an area the size of Lake Michigan, or 0.015% of the global ocean area, could produce the current total landings of all wild capture seafood. It's fascinating. And this doesn't matter just for food, just for basic food so we can eat and survive, but actually seafood in particular is a really critical part of a healthy diet. And you can see some of these facts here. I've got some sources in my notes from the Archives of General Psychiatry, the American Psychological Association, American Association for Cancer Research. All of these studies have come out on why seafood is a really important part of a healthy diet. And then there's the Harvard School of Public Health that also came out with a report, and it analyzed all of the risks of eating seafood, from things like mercury and PCBs compared with all of the benefits. And it says, for major health outcomes among adults, the benefits of eating fish greatly outweigh the risks. And in fact, the Harvard School of Public Health partnered with the World Health Organization and some other entities to come out with a letter saying, we need people to eat more seafood. Like, let's stop warning people away from it. It's a really important part of our health. And we're doing a really poor job at it. This is our per capita weekly protein consumption in the US. And seafood is circled up there just so you can see it in case you missed it. And it pales in comparison to what we're eating in beef and poultry. And in fact, if you add the peanuts with the tree nuts, we're eating more nuts than we are seafood. Nothing against nuts, just saying. Less than 1 in 5 Americans eats the recommended 2 servings of seafood a week. Less than 1 in 5. So getting back to why this matters to GMRI and why we wanted to do this lecture, we think that there is huge potential for aquaculture in the state of Maine and globally for food production and security, for jobs growth to employ people, and for marine economic diversification. In fact, and this is from our website, I'm not going to read this out loud, but in the interest of full disclosure, we have a program that is intending to grow aquaculture in the state of Maine. And with a lot of misconceptions out there about aquaculture, one of the things that's really stood in the way of the United States increasing aquaculture production are those misperceptions and those generalizations that people have about fish farming or aquaculture and its impact on the environment. So let's try to debunk some of those myths. Fact or fishy? We're going to start with farm-raised Atlantic salmon. Salmon is the second most consumed seafood product in the United States. Anybody know what the first? Shrimp. Tuna is third. Shrimp is number 1. Tuna is third. Number 4. Let's keep playing, huh?
Whitefish.
It is a whitefish. Tilapia is number 4 today, and we're going to talk about tilapia in a few minutes too. So, fact or fishy, salmon require a lot of feed. I really like this depiction of the amount of pounds of feed it requires for different animal proteins for 1 pound of feed, or 1 pound of product produced. This came from National Geographic. You can find a lot of charts like this online. They're all basically, as far as ratios go, pretty much the same. I've also seen 10 pounds of feed required for every pound of beef produced. I've seen 4 pounds of feed for every pound of pork produced, and 2 for chicken. It varies. It probably varies from farm to farm, but generally these are the ratios that you will find basically whatever source you look at. But when you compare the amount of feed required for something like cattle, or even chicken compared to salmon, salmon do not require a lot of feed. So that's fishy. Salmon do not require a lot of feed in comparison to other animal based protein production systems. So the next one is, but what about forage fish? What about those marine proteins and marine oils? Well, back in 1980, you can see that forage fish, or I should say, be really accurate here, marine oil and marine protein made up about 90% of salmon feed, generally. Today, they've gotten that down to less than 30%. So they've replaced that fish meal with other land-based plant proteins. So you could argue that salmon feeds do not require a lot of forage fish. But I think there's a question here, because is 30% still a lot? Is that too much? But I'll tell you what worries me even more, which is what is the environmental impact of the land-based plant production going into the salmon feed? So now we've taken it away from wild capture, maybe fish. Maybe it's not even capturing fish. Maybe it's the racks from and the waste from other kinds of fish production systems. And now we're farming, and that has impacts on soil, water, even higher greenhouse gas emissions. So for me, this is a real question mark about how far we've come with feed in salmon. I will still go back to that last slide. The salmon feed ratio is still very low. So, 1.1 pounds of feed for every pound of salmon that comes out. But still, I think there's some questions around what the environmental impact of that feed is. Fact or fishy, farmed salmon threaten native fish stocks. How many of you heard about the escapement out in Washington State? Yeah, Cook Aquaculture is a farm out there, and right in line with the solar eclipse, they had some high tides, and their basically equipment failed, their pens failed, and it was a pen of 300,000 fish. They were able to recapture about 140,000 of those fish, and otherwise the rest escaped. Escapements are really concerning for people because how farmed salmon interact with native fish. Do they end up interbreeding? Do they end up competing with native fish for resources and outcompeting them for natural food, for food in the wild? Do they spread sea lice? So these are all really good questions. On the sea lice front, for example, the research report that I did get my hands on indicated that actually sea lice come from wild populations and infect farmed salmon pens. And so salmon farmers really hate the wild fish because they're the ones that are infecting their farmed fish with sea lice. It becomes a problem for them. On this front, I'll just say whether farmed salmon threaten native fish stocks is a question. I could find no data that supported one side or the other, but you can find a lot of stories, you can find a lot of anecdotes from people that say, oh, I mean, just today I was reading an article that came out that said that somebody found some of these salmon, escaped salmon, with eggs. And then you talk to somebody who's a salmon farmer, and they say that's not even a reasonable expectation that there would be eggs on a farmed salmon. This one is almost impossible to answer with any kind of certainty. But there are some more facts in this case that I think are worth noting. This article came out in the Ellsworth American, and it said that the salmon farm escape in Puget Sound, not an issue for Maine. Well, you might say, well, duh, because it was in Puget Sound, right? I mean, of course it's not an issue for Maine. But the point is that we do have salmon aquaculture here in the state of Maine. Not only that, but they're also Cook Aquaculture Farms. It's the same company. But Cook Aquaculture has more advanced net pens here in the state of Maine that they've been using for the last 10 years that basically prevent salmon escapes. In Washington State, that was a new farm that they had purchased from another company. And as you can see here, and it was in this article, and I had it reaffirmed from somebody at NOAA Fisheries, they had an outstanding application with the state of Wisconsin for a permit to replace the old equipment with new net pens that would prevent salmon escapes. So if that permit had been approved and they would have been able to get the new equipment in there, it was probably pretty likely that that escape wouldn't have happened. There's been one known escape in Maine since 2002. Again, the most current basic pen structure that they use has been in place for the last decade, I understand. The other thing that I think is a really important point about the interaction between wild salmon and farm-raised salmon is this. There we go. 40 to 50% of wild salmon in Alaska start out in hatcheries. In the Pacific Northwest, 80 to 90% of the wild salmon start out in hatcheries. And in fact, hatcheries have been a big part of trying to reintroduce native fish stocks back to their rivers. So what's interesting to me is this interplay between farming and wild capture seafood. So, escaped farm salmon threaten native fish? I don't know. I mean, and frankly, I don't think anybody does. Fact or fishy? Farmed salmon are dyed. Who's heard this one before? Right? I mean, how do they get to be so pink? I mean, we just saw that they're eating mostly like plants, right? Should be green. Yeah, leafy stuff. Anybody here read the Steve Jobs biography? Yeah? Okay, so then you know that he was weird about food, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this guy would go an entire month and eat nothing but apples. And sometimes he'd go an entire month and eat nothing but carrots. You know what happened when we'd go a whole month and eat nothing but carrots? His skin would turn orange, right? And so you could say, if you think that farm-raised salmon are dyed, then you'd also have to say that Steve Jobs was dyed. Because the reason that farm-raised salmon have the pink color that they have are because of the carotenoids that are added to their feed. This is a salmon color chart, and if those carotenoids were not added to their feeds, which also have nutrient benefits to the fish, as well as adding that color, we as consumers would probably not want to buy it. Consumer research has shown, I think it's like 66% of people prefer number 33. That's the color we like to see. But no, it's not a dye. It's in fact a pretty basic color that you would find in feed. So that's fishy. Farmed salmon are not dyed. All right, so which tastes better, wild salmon or farmed salmon? Any opinions on this front? Both taste good? It's all good? Well, the Washington Post conducted a blind taste test, and the results showed that, in fact, the top picks in the blind taste test, prepared all the same way by the same chef, are that farm-raised salmon really beat the wild-caught salmon hands down. In fact, it was the Costco farm-raised frozen salmon that won top billing. And I included the scores in there because they got a 7.6, and the first wild one was like a 5.3. It's a pretty big difference. So, is it fishy that wild fish taste better than farmed? Yeah, wild fish does not taste better than farmed. Oh, it's working. Unless you have a personal preference for wild capture fish, because they taste different. They just taste different from one another. And so some people might prefer wild capture fish, some people might prefer farm-raised fish. So it's up to you. You know, give them both a try and see what you think. I'm going to leave I'm leaving salmon with this one quote from a major food buyer who said, "Whenever I visit a chicken farm, I can't eat chicken for a while. But whenever I visit a salmon farm, I can't wait for my next salmon meal." There's some perspective.
We're not fish.
So,
We don't live in the ocean.
no, I'm glad we don't live in the ocean. We're going to talk about tilapia now. Tilapia, now the fourth most consumed seafood in the United States. Is it true that tilapia eat poop? I mean, this was like on my short list of myths that I wanted to debunk because, like, no way, tilapia don't eat poop, right? Well, so what if they do? Maybe they do, I don't know. You go on any like industry site and it's almost always in the top 10 myths about aquaculture. And I'm like, no, tilapia don't eat poop, it's a myth, it's a myth. So I wanted to dig in a little bit and see whether that's true. It didn't take me long.
This is basically where wastewater treatment begins. We have about 300,000 tilapia and carp in here, right, to get rid of a lot of the particulates.
Particulate poop.
Yes. Once they reach up to harvest size, we harvest them out and sell them.
The fish that help purify the dirty water by eating uneaten food and poo will then be sold on the market for people to eat.
Right, exactly.
That's fantastic.
Fantastic! They do eat poop. But there's more to this story. And that is that, and I'm going to talk about certifications in just a moment. But so this top one is from the Global Aquaculture Alliance Best Practices Standard, which is an international global certification program. And in order for a farm to be certified against their standard, human waste and untreated animal manure shall be prevented from contaminating pond waters. Domestic sewage shall be treated and not contaminate surrounding areas. And this is a picture of typical tilapia feed. Tilapia that are farm raised for industrial export-import markets are fed a typical tilapia feed in the very same way that salmon are. And I talked with a major tilapia buyer and importer who stated flatly, like, absolutely no way that any tilapia that comes in contact with excrement is ever brought to Western markets. So, okay, so it's a fact. Tilapia sometimes eat poop. We have video proof of it. And I'm going to tell you a story in a little bit about a shrimp farm in Thailand. And one of the strategies that they use, their sustainability strategies, is a biomimicry. They call it biomimicry. And they raise the shrimp, and then they have different ponds where the water flows through. And the last pond is a tilapia pond that basically helps clean and purify the water, the waste, from their shrimp farm. And it's a biomimicry. It's a really sustainable, wonderful way of treating the water. And that tilapia is harvested for local consumption. Frankly, I mean, people are like, ooh, tilapia eat poop. I don't know whether that's such a bad thing. I mean, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's like a really great way of, turning waste into food. I don't know. So sometimes they eat poop. But I think it's important to consider where the tilapia that we're purchasing here in the United States is coming from, whether it's been certified against a standard that prevents it from coming in contact with animal or human waste. All right, farmed fish is not healthful. You hear this all the time. Wild fish is much better for you than farm-raised fish. Farm-raised fish is full of antibiotics. Farm-raised fish has higher levels of contaminants than wild capture seafood. and farm-raised fish is lower omega-3s than wild. On the antibiotics front, sometimes farm-raised fish are treated with antibiotics, and they usually get it through their food. It ends up becoming a really high cost part of their feed. So producers try to avoid having to use antibiotics. They do things with probiotics and other mechanisms to have to avoid it. But the real key thing here is that in order to import seafood to the United States, the final product has to show that it is free of antibiotics. So at some point that animal may have been treated with antibiotics, but by the time it makes it into the marketplace in the US, it is free of antibiotics. On the contaminants level, this again depends on where the product was either farm raised or caught. Contaminants are in the water, and it doesn't matter, whether it's being farm raised or wild caught. If they're in the same water, they're going to be exposed to the same kinds of contaminants. So there really is no evidence one way or another. I've actually seen reports that are like, oh, we compared these wild fish to farm raised fish, and the wild had more contaminants. And you'll see other reports that say, oh, the farm had more contaminants. Well, it depends. It just depends on where it comes from. On the omega-3s front, I'm really struggling with even showing you this graphic because, well, first of all, I think it's important to note that salmon, wild or farm-raised, is a superfood. And it has massively high levels of omega-3s compared with other foods, which you can see in this chart. I'll just say, so this is wild Atlantic, and this is farmed Atlantic, and here the farmed has higher levels of omega-3s than the wild. The reason I said I have a hard time with this chart is that I also have another chart that has the exact slight opposite, and based on some other data that the wild has higher levels of it. Who cares? It's a superfood. It's an amazing source of omega-3s. Eat it. It's good for you. Quibbling over whether one has more than the other is kind of missing the point. So farmed fish is healthful. But again, that question about where did it come from and understanding that that has an impact. So is it good? Is it bad? It depends on where it comes from. I love this image. This shows size of continents depicted by how much seafood they produce. And China is not a continent, of course it's a country, but it's such a massive producer of seafood that it's presented here by itself. Well, to help us understand where our farmed fish comes from, there are two primary global certification programs, and one I referenced earlier. One is the Global Aquaculture Alliance's Best Aquaculture Practices program, and the other is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. And both of these do farm-level certifications and require traceability through the supply chain so that you know that the product that is certified actually came from that farm. Over time, these are relatively new inventions, these certifications, but you can see that the number of farms and facilities that are being certified against these standards is going up dramatically. This is Global Aquaculture BAP certified facilities. So Blaine mentioned we work with retail, we work with Food Lion and Hannaford supermarkets, and they require that all of their farmed seafood, whether it's in the fresh case, the frozen section, or the center store like canned fish, all of their farmed seafood is certified to the BAP standard at the farm level or equivalent. So Aquaculture Stewardship Council would also qualify. This demand by retail and by corporations has been a huge motivator for farms to get certified and to change their practices and improve what they're doing on their farms. So the power of that market pull has had a dramatic influence over what's happening in aquaculture globally. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council surveyed their farmers, and 100% of them reported environmental benefits after becoming certified, 100% reported social benefits, 100% reported economic benefits, over 50% said they saw cleaner water that they were discharging, over a third said they were saving money through reduced feed costs. And this is one of the key messages that I have, which is that in all of these things, like in looking at how much feed is being used on farms, there's a real business benefit, right? If you're using fewer inputs to produce product, there's a real business benefit there. And the same with healthier fish. If you have healthier fish, you don't need to use antibiotics. You don't have die-offs. You don't have things like early mortality syndrome. This is a fish farm. This is a shrimp farm in Thailand. In 2012, early mortality syndrome, or EMS, hit Thailand, and they went from producing 600,000 metric tons of shrimp per year to 200,000 metric tons. It killed the industry, this disease. Well, Rubicon Resources is a company that works with shrimp farmers in Thailand and imports shrimp. And I talked with one of the people who actually works with farmers on the ground, and he said EMS is probably the best thing that happened to the Thai shrimp industry, because it really motivated and inspired the farmers to do something different. And they started to listen to us when we talked about good, sustainable practices. And so now they work with them on things. I talked about that biomimicry system, on appropriate lining of ponds, disease prevention, using probiotics. And on the farms that they've been working with, their production actually has doubled in less space. So their farms are smaller now, but their production has gone up on the farms that they're working with. I'm going to pass around some cards. If you don't mind just taking some, helping me pass them around, that'd be great. Again, a really big part of this movement is the power of corporations and industry to build in that market reward and that market pull for good, sustainable practices. These cards are like baseball cards, but of the farmers themselves. And this is what Rubicon, they'll share these cards with their customers and say, here are the people that you're supporting through this purchase. But what I found really interesting is that more importantly, they share these cards back with the farmers, and the farmers are tickled to see their faces and their stories on these cards, to know that those stories are going all the way to the customer that's eating their shrimp. And it produces this immense sense of pride. And then loyalty to these sustainability practices, because they're not easy. And meanwhile, you've got Asian markets that will pay huge dollars, and they don't care yet how those shrimp are being raised. And so there's a lot of competition on farms to say, we want you to be sustainable. We don't care, and we'll still pay you a lot of money. So these kinds of tactics are really, really ingenious in maintaining that loyalty and really engaging farmers on the ground. I also want to note, because I had talked about certification, Nick at Rubicon also pointed out that there are 15,000 shrimp farms in Thailand, and 200 of them are certified. So there's a long way to go. So I'm not saying that everything is certified and that everything meets these great environmental practices. It's really hard sometimes to get the certification bodies on the ground. So Rubicon is working with farmers to get group certifications and to coordinate those certifications to get more farms involved. And they're working with the government of Thailand to put in place government regulations and laws so that it becomes ubiquitous across the country. Another innovation in aquaculture is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. IMTA is bringing together growing things like kelp with salmon, with mussels, in a system that helps to clean and feed itself. I'm not going to talk about IMTA. This is my chance to pitch the fact that all of our lectures from the Sea State Lecture Series are archived online, and you can go online and see them. Terry Chopin came and presented with us April 24th, 2015, and if you go online, you can find his full lecture on IMTA in our archives. So to summarize, there are two myths about aquaculture or farmed fish. And one is that farmed fish is good, and the other myth is that it's bad. It can be awesome, and it can be terrible. And it really depends on where it comes from and what those farm level practices are. Aquaculture is a really important part of food production, particularly on a growing planet, and particularly on a planet that needs healthy sources of protein. And finally, there are a lot of innovations going on. I told you the story about the shrimp in Thailand. There are aquaculture improvement projects going on in China, other aquaculture improvement projects in Indonesia. These are really hard things to do, so it takes a lot of people and a lot of commitment and time. But what we're seeing is that they are good for business, and the more that we can get out there to farmers at the farm level and demonstrate that they can produce more and make more by being more sustainable, I think we'll have a really strong trajectory of engagement. It all depends on where it comes from. So ask questions. Just a second. Not yet. Not of me. Not of me. Don't ask questions of me. Ask questions of the people selling you seafood. In Hannaford, for example, I mentioned that they require farm level certification, right? But you won't see that BAP label on their fish. It's stated in their policy, and I work directly with them and all of their suppliers to make sure that we have those farm level certification codes. So check out their policies, check out other policies, ask questions. If they can't answer your questions or if they don't have a policy yet, you're still sending a message to them that you care. When I started this work 8.5 years ago, I'd go meet with seafood companies and others and say, sustainability, let's talk about making sure that we have fish to sell in the future. Okay, yeah, we'll get it. It's a fad. We'll get on board because Hannaford wants us to, but nobody really cares. Nobody's asking for it, and we hear that from others who sell seafood. They say, well, yeah, I guess, but nobody's asking me where the seafood's coming from. Nobody wants to know whether it's sustainable. It's almost like calling your senator. They can get 2 phone calls and that's all they need to help them make a decision. It's the same thing with people who sell you seafood. Ask questions, find out where it comes from. You don't have to be an expert. I want to be clear about this too. You don't have to know whether farm-raised shrimp from Thailand is okay. But if the person you're buying your shrimp from can answer questions, then chances are they have done their research. If they can't, then hopefully you've inspired them to start asking questions of their own. So finally, I'm going to take it home, back home, my home, Wisconsin, where I grew up in the rolling hills of southwest Wisconsin. This is really what it looked like. It still looks like this. It's beautiful. I love it. I love driving along the rolling hills and seeing the cornfields, and every once in a while it gets a little stinky, I won't lie. When they put the manure on the fields as fertilizer to feed the food that they're growing, it can get a little raunchy. But when I go back home and they've spread the manure on the fields, it's also kind of like I get this sense of nostalgia, right? Because I grew up with it, and it's still like, that's cool. That smells good. So how does this picture compare with this shrimp farm in Thailand, or with this salmon farm in Chile? And what do we think about how they fit together in the future of food production? Thank you for being here. And I'll just say you're welcome to keep the cards if you want to, but if you don't, please give them back to me. Like, don't trash them. I'll use them again and look at them and stuff. So thank you.
So I saw all your hands go up because Jen actually is willing to answer a question. She wasn't, it's a little bit of a bait and switch, but so it's 10 of 8. We try to honor our time, so we have about 10 minutes. So please ask Jen questions, and I'll remind her to repeat the questions so that everybody can hear as you answer them.
Great.
So I'll keep time. You guys just ask Jen. She'll call in.
Right back there in blue shirt.
Jen, is there any testing done of seafood when it comes into this country by governmental agencies or whatever?
Yes. Yes. Is there any testing done of seafood when it comes into the country? The answer is yes. And this is something that I really wanted to get some definitive numbers around. Rumor is that about 2% of the seafood that's imported in the country is actually tested. What I don't understand is whether that's a sufficient data sample of what's being imported, like how much should be tested. I also don't know if that's an accurate number. But yes, there is testing of seafood as it comes into the country. Right down here.
brought up the Hannaford,
Yes.
Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, Shaw's, where do they sit?
Yes, so the question is, I brought up Hannaford, so where do Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and Shaw's and other retailers stand? So I bring up Hannaford because I work directly with Hannaford. I'm intimately familiar with their policy. I'm confident that every single one of those retailers that you mentioned has their own sustainable seafood sourcing policy. In fact, we are a member of something called the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions, and it's an organization of about 30 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that do work across North America. And each of us has partnerships with different retailers, and those partnerships represent 80% of the seafood market in North America. So NGOs like Monterey Bay Aquarium, Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, I won't name all 30 of them, but we're all working with corporations like Walmart, Sam's Club, Giant Eagle, Whole Foods, to advise them on their seafood sourcing and engage them in practices that will not only support the really good stuff going on, but really inspire and motivate those improvements and innovations. Yeah, right here.
What is the primary ingredient that they feed in Maine farm salmon?
What is the primary ingredient? Yeah.
And also, how does that compare with what a wild salmon would eat?
Right. What is the primary ingredient that they feed farmed salmon in Maine, and how does that compare with wild salmon? The right answer is I don't know. And but this is a great opportunity for me to say that I had the opportunity to chat with Sebastian Bell, who's the executive director of the Maine Aquaculture Association, this last weekend, and he said, look, please be sure to tell everybody that if they have any questions about aquaculture in Maine, to give me a call. He's an open book. He can tell you, he's been around a long time. He can tell you the history of really bad stuff that has happened and what's going on today. He's just a wealth of information and is really welcoming to any phone calls. So I'm deferring to Sebastian at the Maine Aquaculture Association and those kinds of questions. He even offered to take you out to a farm if you want to go check out a farm and see what's going on. And I said he's an expert in the state of Maine, but I also want to brag a little bit because Sebastian Bell has been a leader in actually developing those global standards and what is acceptable and sustainable through like the Global Aquaculture Alliance. He's been an international leader in aquaculture and has held Maine at the forefront of all of that. Back there, and then there.
I have a comment and a question.
Oh, sorry, right here. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my comment is simply with Costco. I suspect the reason they're number one is that their cost is about 1/4 to 1/2 the price of the equivalent salmon in your local supermarket. It's really very expensive. My question is, I went to a huge shrimp farm in Vietnam. In Vietnam, the houses are above the water, and they have no toilet facilities. They have a hole in the floor, right where the shrimp are being breeded. I don't know of any way to determine whether your shrimp come from Vietnam or Thailand, and it's going to turn you off pretty quickly.
Well, so your first note was about your suspicion that Costco rated better because it's so inexpensive on the whether it tastes. I want to be clear about this. It was a blind taste test, and it was a panel of people who sat and ate what was served to them. They were not purchasing it. In the write-up, they suspected that it tasted better because it was saltier, and so that's probably why the Costco frozen fish tasted better. On your second question about farmed shrimp in Vietnam, and what you observed with no toilet facilities, and they're basically, going into the ponds. I think the only thing I can say about that is that any generalization, that I would caution against any generalization like that farmed shrimp from Vietnam is bad. I would say farmed shrimp from that particular facility is maybe not meet the standards that we would want it to meet. But there may be really good farmed shrimp production in Vietnam. And that's where it becomes really nuanced and difficult to know, where good stuff is coming from. But there's a real danger in generalizing whole countries because for the players that are doing excellent work in those countries, they end up becoming penalized by virtue of their neighbors' activities. But thanks for the observation. Yep, back there and then over there.
I saw a brief TV show about the University of Maine doing a lot with aquaculture. Do you know about that? Can you talk about it?
The University of Maine is doing a lot with aquaculture, and no, I would not be somebody who could speak
But it is, I mean, they're a leader.
to that. Yeah, in Sea Grant, I mean, actually in Maine, there's so many neat things going on in aquaculture, and on the research front, and then training, so like training fishermen who might, like their high season might be in the summer with lobster, but they might want to grow kelp over the winter, and so there are training programs through Sea Grant in partnership with Maine Aquaculture Association in helping fishermen diversify their own businesses, so that combination of wild and farmed. So there's a lot of really neat, innovative things going on in Maine. One of my favorite stories is Sarah Rademacher, who started a company called American Unagi. And you might have heard of the glass eel industry, where they're getting $1,200+ a pound for these baby eels that are shipped over to Asia, where they're grown out and then sold, and sometimes sold back here in the United States. She's like, why are we giving away the value of our eels? So she is now farming these glass eels. She has to pay $1,200 a pound for the babies too, and farming them in a closed containment on land-based site for sale. And I got a chance to try some of her smoked unagi product, and it is fabulous. So it's really neat to see some of the things going on in Maine. There's here.
This may be one of those generalizations, but I spent a day with an executive chef worldwide, a big purchaser, and he's very negative on tilapia because it's destructive to other food, not the your farm versus wild, just the destructive nature overcompetes. Is that something you would buy into?
So whether tilapia overcompetes and it's destructive to other food, I mean, I'd be curious to have a conversation with him and why he thinks that. Because in thinking about, again, needing to feed the world, tilapia it may be a godsend, really. It's a very easy fish to produce. It needs very little inputs. It's a flaky white fish that takes on any flavor that you give to it. I'm not really sure what his particular concern is about tilapia. I learned just this morning that there's somebody farming tilapia locally here in Portland. I don't know if you knew that. I just learned this today. And they're selling it for $15 a pound. In Wyndham too?
Yeah, somebody tried it on Long Island.
So, and classrooms are growing tilapia, and it's just a really easy fish to produce. So I'm not sure what his arguments are. I'd be curious to talk, more about why he thinks that tilapia is threatening other foods. I don't know. Yeah, ma'am.
Salmon genetically modified to grow faster so that they can come to market faster than wild fish. Is that a myth or is that a reality?
I'm really glad you asked whether farm-raised salmon are genetically modified to grow faster. It's probably something I should have included in my talk. Thank you. In fact, there are no genetically modified salmon in the U.S. marketplace. It's not legal. It hasn't been approved for sale. And have salmon been bred to perhaps grow in different ways or appreciate different kinds of food that are better for, in the same way that we breed other land-based animals? Sure, but they are not genetically modified organisms. No GMOs in seafood.
I'm going to interrupt.
Okay.
It's 8 o'clock. It doesn't mean that you can't stay and ask questions, but it does mean I honor, if anyone wants to leave, it's 8 o'clock and we keep time here. So those of you who want to leave, you may. Those of you who'd like to stay, I'm sure Jen will be willing to linger and answer your additional questions. So first I want to thank you. It was really interesting. I learned a lot tonight. We talk about this all the time. Second, I want to remind you all that we have these continuing lectures. We hope that you see you in future opportunities here. And the last thing is, you all came here for free. And I'm the director. My colleagues, when they welcome you here, remind you that it is really important for us to do the work we do, that we get support. And so to the extent that you're interested in getting involved with us or learning more about us, you can give online, you can get an envelope, you can give another time, you can tell other people about us. There's ways you can help us, and we would appreciate it. Thank you all.